title suggests, this is really work that focuses on supply chains. And as you heard in my introduction, that a lot of my work has been on stochastic optimization. And what interested me in this aspect of supply chains is how supply chains actually are vehicles for mitigating risk. That supply chains, the global structure, we think of the global structure as being ways in which we can bring people together from different parts of the world and give them goods and services in a more efficient manner. But it's also a vehicle for actually distributing and mitigating risk. And so that's kind of the connection to supply chains. And the other thing I wanted to bring up, part of what I'm going to talk about deals with how supply chains don't just share in terms of the goods and services that they provide from one firm to another, but also they share in the financial burden of distributing those goods and services. And it's the financial burden, the trade credit that we see between firms, that is also a way in which firms are able to share and distribute risk. It's something that was pointed out to me when I was talking to the man who gave the chair that I hold, Jerry Levin, who is essentially a turnaround specialist. He's been the CEO of many companies, including Revlon, the cosmetic maker, Sunbeam, electronic appliance producer, and Sharper Impact, a retailer. So I was describing to Jerry what my work was on trade credit, and he says, that's an important thing for my firm. He now has a firm that imports, again, primarily for retailers, but imports a lot of product that is produced in China. And he said when the dollar was strengthening, he realized that he was actually paying a lot more in terms of yuan for what his products were than what he was in the past. And so he went to his suppliers and he said, I'm actually paying you more, even though I'm paying you the same price in dollars. I'm giving you more yuan than you had in the past. So maybe we can renegotiate our contract on price. And the supplier said, well, there's no way that we can change the price. We really don't want to change the price, but what we can do is to change the terms of credit. And so they changed the term, they lengthened the term over which they had to pay without changing the price. And so there are various mechanisms, including how long you have to pay as well as what price you pay, that firms use to balance risk between themselves. So that's a point that came to me from Jerry, and that also, I think, permeates this work. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about supply chains, how they gain efficiency by enabling this mitigation of risk, this transfer of risk, and how sometimes they can help. That is, sometimes your supplier having a good shock, having something good happen to it can help that firm, or how sometimes your customer having a good shock can help you, or vice versa. When your supplier has something happen that's a negative, then that also impacts a firm. And how a firm's position within sort of the global network of all firms, how that position within this global network actually affects the function of that firm and the performance of that firm. Okay, so the themes that I'm going to talk about then are that supply chains operate as vehicles. That obviously there's direct physical transfer of goods and services, but they also act as financial vehicles. And these financial vehicles help firms coordinate. They help firms actually gain in efficiency. So not just the physical product that they transform from one form to another, but also the financial service that they perform. However, when we have multiple suppliers, there's a tension. When multiple suppliers are working together, there's a tension that any one of them might end up failing, or any one of them might have an incentive maybe not to put in the same sort of effort. We see this to some extent if you've read about what happened with Boeing and the delays with the 787 Dreamliner. Having many different suppliers from all around the world, sometimes that can create problems in that there's no incentive for all of them to have to push forward on a project if they think one of them isn't going to. So if they think any one of them has potential for not being able to deliver on time or being able to deliver all that is required at the proper time, then there's a motivation for the others then not to perform. So having multiple suppliers actually is a challenge. It's a challenge that firms have to deal with, and I'll talk about how it affects firms in different industries in different ways. There's also correlation reliability issues among suppliers and creditors, and they create some kinds of nonlinear effects. So the effects that you might see just using linear regressions are not everything that happens in the supply chain or across supply chains. So there are various nonlinear effects that we see because of these connections as well. And including those nonlinear effects leads to a wide variety of different kinds of equilibrium, and it leads to the kinds of networks that we see, where we might have some very concentrated firms, whereas others maybe have only single suppliers or single sets of customers. And by looking at some new databases, I'm going to talk about one that's available from Bloomberg called the SPLC database, provides opportunities to investigate the structure of supply chains. And they have a database covering 25,000 firms around the world and looking at how those 25,000 firms interact with one another. Who are their suppliers? Who are their customers within that network? How much do they depend on those suppliers and customers throughout the world? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'll talk about trade credit, which I mentioned. I'll talk about some things that happen just because you have multiple suppliers or multiple trade creditors in this case. And then I'll talk about what we might see in terms of networks, how networks might evolve out of these connections, both in terms of the physical services that are being performed, as well as financial services in the form of credit. And to see what happens in terms of networks. And then I'll look at, well, what kinds of effects can we observe from the data about the structure of these networks, both sort of on a linear scale, and then also looking at some of the nonlinear effects that might appear.